Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are opening up a text that is, well, it's highly controversial.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's deeply polarizing, and honestly, it's just legally dense. It's a 2024 book by Conrad Riker called Marriage Deception: How Feminists Use No-Fault Divorce to Lose Everything.
It's a massive text.
It really is. And before we get into the weeds of this ultra-long, incisive, and honestly fascinating ebook, I want to remind you to hit that like button and subscribe to the show so you never miss one of our deep dives.
Right, definitely subscribe.
And also, if you want to understand the history of our institutions before they were, as the author argues here, captured by feminists and Marxists,
Yeah.
you are absolutely going to want to check out Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play books.
Yeah, to buy the ebook for yourself, you really need to read it to get the full context.
Exactly. Go buy it for yourself. And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Highly recommend that.
So our mission today isn't to take a side, right? It's to impartially deconstruct Riker's core thesis,
Right.
which is that modern legal frameworks and cultural norms were, systematically engineered to dismantle traditional masculinity and the nuclear family. But before we unpack that first chapter, we need to establish exactly how we're approaching this material.
Yeah, that is a crucial point, and I want to step in firmly right here at the top to issue a clear, objective disclaimer to you, the listener.
Please do.
Because the source material we are examining today contains highly politically charged content.
Very much so.
It dives deeply into complex gender dynamics, critiques of left-wing ideologies, and explorations of right-wing and men's rights activism. So I want to explicitly state to you that this deep dive will impartially report on the contents of the book.
Exactly.
We are not endorsing, validating, or taking sides on any of these viewpoints.
No, not at all. Our role here is strictly analytical.
Precisely. We are just going to break down the arguments exactly as they are presented by the author to help you understand his core thesis, the historical lineage he draws upon, and the evidence he uses.
Okay, let's unpack this. Riker doesn't start with some wide sociological lens, right? He starts right at the intimate level of personal relationships.
Right into the household.
Yeah. Section 1 introduces this concept he terms the illusion of choice. And he pairs this with a really deep critique of modern consent theory.
Right, which is fascinating because the baseline assumption most of us have in the modern Western world is that we enter into marriages entirely of our own volition.
We think of it as like the ultimate free market transaction of human emotion.
Exactly. But Riker argues that this is fundamentally a mirage. He frames this as the choice myth.
The choice myth.
Yeah, the reality he paints for men is one where the modern marital contract is presented as a voluntary agreement, but is actually signed under this pervasive systemic duress.
Right.
The text argues that men are frequently pressured into highly unfavorable deals. He specifically points to incredibly one-sided prenuptial agreements under the guise of making a free choice.
So he asks you to look at the leverage, right?
Exactly, the leverage. The author contends that the power dynamics are heavily skewed before the paperwork is even drafted.
Because men are acting on a deep biological drive.
Right, a social and biological drive to secure a partner and raise children. So they feel compelled to agree to terms that leave them highly vulnerable financially and legally.
Choice, but
A choice made with a gun to their head, according to Riker. Accept these precarious terms, or face a life of isolation and the denial of fatherhood.
And to explain exactly how that leverage is maintained day to day, Riker traces the evolution of consent theory.
Yes.
Now, historically, we think of the emphasis on sexual consent as a crucial development for personal safety.
Bodily economy, right.
Exactly. And Riker traces this model framework back to second-wave feminists like Gloria Steinem in the 1960s and 70s. But he argues that while it was championed as a tool for autonomy, it is fundamentally morphed into a mechanism of domestic control.
Precisely. He's looking at how theory translates into domestic reality. According to the text, consent theory is now frequently weaponized by women within a marriage to withhold intimacy.
While simultaneously demanding continued financial support.
And physical protection and emotional provision from their male partners. The author's critique is that this creates a highly uneven unilateral power dynamic,
Because the traditional contract implicitly promised mutual care.
which included physical intimacy. But modern interpretations of consent, Riker argues, allow one partner, the woman, to unilaterally redefine the terms of the relationship at any moment.
She can just withdraw the physical component entirely.
Right. Yet the man remains legally and socially obligated to fulfill his traditional role as a provider. He's essentially held hostage by his desire to keep his family intact.
And the text uses these specific, heavily detailed case studies to make this abstract theory feel concrete. Because just talking about consent theory sounds so academic.
Yeah, Riker wants you to see the psychological toll.
Like the story of Paul and Lisa.
Right, Paul?
Paul is a 35-year-old engineer, makes a good living, he's stable. Marries 28-year-old Lisa after what the book describes as a whirlwind romance.
He thought he secured his life partner.
Exactly. Entered the traditional social contract. But a few years in, according to the book, Lisa simply began withholding sex. No infidelity, no abuse, just a unilateral withdrawal of intimacy.
Which completely baffled Paul.
Sent him into a psychological tailspin. He paid for therapy, tried to win her back in his own home, but it eventually led to a divorce. And here's where Riker's point about leverage comes in.
Right, the divorce proceedings.
During the divorce, Lisa used the threat of a prolonged, agonizing legal battle over their assets to demand a massive financial settlement. She withheld intimacy, broke the foundational premise of the marriage, and yet walked away financially enriched.
And that financial enrichment is key to his argument. He's pointing out that the legal system does not penalize the withdrawal of intimacy, but it heavily penalizes the withdrawal of financial support.
It enforces one side of the contract but not the other.
Exactly, and he doubles down on this with Mark and Sarah.
Oh yeah, Mark's story.
Mark is a 40-year-old salesman. After the birth of their first child, the book states that Sarah denied him intimacy entirely. Mark was desperate, wanted to save the marriage, keep his family under one roof.
But she was entirely unconcerned.
Because she knew her position was secure. This dynamic drove Mark into profound desperation, eventually leading him to seek out online dating just to find basic human connection.
Which, of course, positioned him as the bad guy when the marriage failed.
Exactly. And if we connect these individual case studies to the broader societal picture, Riker is asking you to consider the macro-level ramifications here.
Yeah.
The book asserts that this dynamic causes deep emotional manipulation, psychological abuse, and toxic resentment. Extrapolating from that, the text argues that this imbalance is a primary overlooked driver behind the broader breakdown of the nuclear family.
Because men aren't just suddenly deciding to abandon their families.
Right. Riker argues they are becoming acutely aware of these predatory, legally sanctioned behaviors. Consequently, men are opting out of marriage altogether, creating a crisis of declining birth rates.
So, if men are entering these contracts at a profound disadvantage, what happens when the contract actually breaks? That takes us into the second major pillar of the book.
The shift from the household to the courtroom.
Yes. The dark origins and catastrophic impact of no-fault divorce. He shifts the focus entirely to how this specific legal framework fundamentally altered the American family in the 60s and 70s.
This is where the historical analysis gets incredibly provocative. The book makes the claim that no-fault divorce actually has deep, calculated Marxist roots.
I have to pause you there because that sounds like a massive leap to a lot of people. How does he trace a line from Soviet Marxism to suburban American family courts?
He traces it through the ideological goals of the early Marxist revolutionaries. The text astonishingly connects the conceptual groundwork of dismantling the family unit directly to Vladimir Lenin. Yeah, Riker quotes Lenin directly, "An ounce of action is worth a ton of theory." The book uses this to demonstrate that for the early Bolsheviks, dismantling the traditional family wasn't a byproduct of the revolution, it was a calculated goal.
Because the traditional family is the building block of capitalism.
Exactly. Where property, inheritance, and conservative values are passed down, to weaken the state, you had to break the family. You had to sever the reliance of women on their husbands and transfer it to the state.
And his argument is that this ideology mutated and found its way into Western culture, specifically through the feminist movement of the 1960s.
Yes. He points to influential figures like Betty Friedan, author of The Feminine Mystique. Riker argues Friedan and her contemporaries took this Marxist concept and repackaged it for an American audience.
They pushed for no-fault divorce.
Not as a legal reform for extreme cases of abuse, but as an ideological tool to liberate women from what they deemed an inherently oppressive institution.
By removing the need to prove fault like adultery.
Right. They made the marital contract the only legally binding contract in society that can be dissolved by one party at any time for any reason, with the state automatically intervening to divide the assets.
It is a wild historical connection. But the book backs up the devastating reality of this system with some staggering statistics.
Heavy citations, too.
Yeah, he deliberately cites Susan Faludi's famous 1991 feminist book, Backlash.
Right.
He notes the widely accepted statistic that women initiate approximately 70% of all divorces today.
And if college-educated women are isolated, that number jumps to around 90%.
90%. So Riker asks you, the reader, if marriage is an oppressive patriarchal institution, why are men desperately trying to stay in it, and why are women overwhelmingly pulling the ripcord?
And his answer to that is found in the work of Dr. Stephen Baskerville. Riker pulls heavily from Baskerville's book, Taken into Custody, which details how family courts actually operate. Baskerville argues that family courts have evolved into a tyrannical scourge on men. They routinely strip men of basic constitutional due process. Evidentiary standards are lowered, hearsay is accepted.
And men are presumed guilty of being unfit parents just by virtue of being the male.
Exactly.
To ground this massive legal critique, Riker brings in the story of George. George is a 42-year-old man who supported his wife financially while she went back to school as a gender studies student.
Which changed everything.
Totally. Her immersion in this progressive academic environment fundamentally changed her view of their marriage. She didn't claim George was abusive, she just decided she was unfulfilled and initiated a no-fault divorce.
And Riker details how she utilized the family court system with ruthless efficiency.
Yeah, because George was the primary earner, the court stripped him of primary custody, relegating him to an every other weekend visitor, and forced him to pay exorbitant alimony and child support based on his maximum earning potential,
Leaving him financially crippled.
living in a small apartment while funding the lifestyle of the woman who unilaterally broke their family apart.
This narrative serves as a vital pivot point. It raises an urgent question. How did a legal framework that produces such catastrophic outcomes for men become culturally acceptable?
How did dismantling a father's life become a routine administrative function?
Exactly. And this brings us to section 3, where the deep dive shifts from the courtroom to the culture at large. Riker explores cultural Marxism, queer theory, and the proliferation of gender studies.
The book posits that these ideologies have intentionally infiltrated our mainstream institutions to wage a coordinated war on masculinity.
The war on masculinity.
Yeah, let's focus on that term because it gets thrown around a lot. It sounds like a bumper sticker, but Riker actually dives into some heavy philosophical frameworks to explain how this war operates on a subconscious level.
He does, and to do this, he reaches for the concept of the Hegelian dialectic.
Wait, let's break that down for a second. That's heavy philosophical jargon. Applying a 19th century German philosophical framework to modern gender relations. How does that work?
It's a framework of conflict and resolution. In the Hegelian dialectic, you start with a thesis, the established status quo.
Okay.
Then an antithesis arises, which is a direct opposing reaction to the thesis. These two forces clash, and the resulting compromise is the synthesis. Riker uses this model in Marxist terms.
So what's the thesis here?
He argues that the traditional male role, the protector, the provider, the stoic head of the household, is the thesis. This was the natural order of things for centuries.
Okay, so if traditional masculinity is the thesis, how exactly does Riker define the antithesis in a practical day-to-day sense?
The antithesis is the rise of radical feminism, queer theory, and progressive gender ideologies that actively deconstruct and attack that traditional role.
Got it.
The antithesis argues that the provider is actually an oppressor, that stoicism is toxic masculinity, and that the nuclear family is a prison. So you have the thesis clashing with the antithesis.
And the result of that clash, the synthesis.
Riker argues this isn't a peaceful compromise. The resulting synthesis is the total erosion of traditional masculinity, the pathologization of normal male behavior, and the fundamental destabilization of society.
He views it as a deliberate cycle designed to break down the natural order.
Exactly.
And what's fascinating is how he proves this synthesis is being pushed onto the public. He points directly at our living rooms. He eagerly dissects pop culture.
He really does.
The book is packed with specific call-outs. He argues that beloved TV shows follow a highly coordinated pattern. Take Friends. Characters like Ross and Chandler are constantly depicted as neurotic or bumbling.
While Monica and Rachel are the grounded, competent forces.
Right. And he looks at prestige television like Mad Men.
Ah.
Don Draper looks like a traditional masculine archetype, but the show is entirely dedicated to deconstructing him as morally deficient and spiritually empty.
Ultimately pathetic. It's a trope that has become so ubiquitous we barely notice it. The incompetent, goofy father who needs his hyper-competent wife to save him.
Exactly. And he applies this to blockbuster movies too. The Wolf of Wall Street, The Social Network. The male protagonists are portrayed as greedy or socially inept.
Even when successful, yeah.
Meanwhile, the female characters are the moral compasses, superhumanly virtuous. He even points to the video game industry. specifically Fortnite.
That was an interesting example.
Right. Riker claims the male avatars are frequently depicted as ridiculous or goofy, while the female characters are almost universally designed as sleek, hyper-competent, serious warriors.
He argues this isn't an accident. It is a deliberate propaganda machine designed to teach young boys that masculinity is inherently flawed, while femininity is inherently superior.
And this infiltration isn't confined to entertainment.
No, it goes right into the education system. Riker heavily critiques modern public schooling, backing his claims with data. He cites a highly comprehensive 2019 report from the National Center for Education Statistics.
The data on boys falling behind.
Yes. It clearly shows that girls are not only vastly surpassing boys in reading and writing proficiency, but they are rapidly closing the historical gap in math and science.
And boys make up the vast majority of disciplinary actions and ADHD diagnoses.
Right. And Riker's thesis is that this statistical disparity is not due to a sudden biological drop in male potential.
Far from it.
He argues the progressive education system has actively created a hostile, anti-male environment. Classrooms have been redesigned to favor a more docile, compliant, feminine learning style.
Sitting still, collaborative group work.
Exactly. Emotional articulation. Meanwhile, traditional boyish behavior, high energy, competitiveness, rough and tumble play is instantly pathologized
Punished with zero tolerance policies.
and medicated into submission. The school system isn't failing boys. It is working exactly as intended by cultural Marxists, suppressing male energy from kindergarten upward.
So, if the media and education system are eroding the male role culturally, he takes that a massive, controversial step further when looking at the physical necessity of the father.
This is section 4.
Yeah, this organic pivot brings us to undeniably one of the most explosive, controversial chapters in the entire ebook. It focuses heavily on Planned Parenthood and the reproductive rights movement.
I will synthesize Riker's claims here as objectively as possible because the accusations are profound.
Please do.
The book argues that Planned Parenthood masquerades in the public eye as a benevolent champion of women's health care. However, Riker claims that beneath this veneer, the organization is actually pushing a sinister anti-family, anti-male agenda.
And he traces the origins back to Margaret Sanger in the early 20th century.
Yes.
This is where he brings in the history of eugenics, right?
He spends significant time detailing Sanger's alleged connections to the eugenics movement and even sympathetic ties to fascist thinkers. He claims her driving philosophy wasn't women's empowerment, but population control.
To physically prevent those she deemed unfit from reproducing.
Yes, engineering a more desirable society. And Riker argues that this rotten foundation still infects the core operational philosophy of the organization today.
He pulls no punches. He labels it the abortion industrial complex.
He does.
He notes that in the year 2020 alone, Planned Parenthood performed 354,871 abortions. But he doesn't just drop that number to debate the morality. He uses it to expose what he claims is a massive financial incentive.
Right, he ties this to an alleged secret partnership with the pharmaceutical industry.
Specifically, the mass distribution of the abortifacient drug RU-486.
He paints a picture of a multi-billion-dollar machine profiting from the severing of the reproductive process.
And he uses the famous quote from Winston Churchill here. The cost of liberty is less than the price of repression. Riker twists this to argue that allowing state-funded organizations to dictate family planning results in the ultimate repression of traditional family values.
And the deliberate marginalization of fathers. I want to highlight how he connects this back to the core thesis. How does reproductive rights connect directly to the declining status of men? The book argues that as technology gave women unilateral control over reproduction through the pill or accessible abortion, the biological and social necessity of long-term male commitment decreased dramatically.
Because the risk of pregnancy no longer requires the safety net of a provider.
Exactly. Historically, the potential for pregnancy bound men and women together. By decoupling sex from the risk of reproduction, women no longer needed a committed husband to survive or raise a child.
Which feeds directly back into the spike in no-fault divorces.
Right. The physical necessity of the father was eliminated by science, paving the way for the legal necessity of the husband to be eliminated by family courts.
It's all a cohesive dismantling, in his view.
That's his argument, yes.
So we have the psychological leverage of consent theory, the legal trap of family courts, the cultural programming of media and schools, and the biological decoupling of reproduction. If all these institutions are stacked against men, where do they go?
What happens to millions of disenfranchised men?
Here's where it gets really interesting. The book shifts gears and explores the manosphere. He describes it as a vital digital refuge on platforms like Reddit and 4chan.
A safe haven where men can speak freely without the policing of feminist cultural norms. And Riker approaches this with almost an anthropological lens.
It isn't treated as a monolith at all.
No, he dissects the space into specific factions. First, men's rights activism, or the MRM.
Legally focused faction.
Right, highly concentrated on exposing institutional injustices, biases in family court, false accusations, lack of due process in Title IX tribunals.
They're looking for legislative reform.
Yes. The book cites Warren Farrell's 2001 book, The Myth of Male Power, as the intellectual catalyst. Farrell argued that men, not women, are uniquely overlooked and inherently disposable.
Pointing to workplace deaths and combat casualties.
Exactly. Then, moving from the political to the psychological, the book details the red pill.
The metaphor from The Matrix.
Taking the red pill awakens you to the harsh, hidden truth of reality. The truth they are waking up to is the hidden reality of biological gender dynamics.
They focus heavily on hypergamy.
That's a crucial term here. Hypergamy is the theory that women are biologically hardwired to constantly seek to mate up the socioeconomic ladder.
Looking for the absolute best provider and allegedly abandoning a partner if a better option appears.
Right. And the red pill strategy is for men to relentlessly improve their own value while maintaining masculine
Frame. The ability to assert unwavering emotional control.
refusing to bend to emotional tests, being an immovable rock. Next, the author explores MGTOW men going their own way, a strictly separatist approach.
They believe the system is so rigged, the only rational choice is to completely opt out. No marriage, no cohabitation.
Right.
To illustrate this, the book shares the story of Jack, a divorced man left financially devastated by family courts. Instead of fighting, Jack simply walked away from all societal expectations.
Downsized his life.
Moved to a rural area focused entirely on his financial independence. Went off the grid of the culture war. Riker quotes the poet Robert Frost to encapsulate this. In 3 words, I can sum up everything I've learned about life. It goes on.
And finally, the book touches on the PUA, or pickup artist, community. The oldest faction, traced back to the 70s and 80s, with figures like Ross Jeffries and his speed seduction.
And Neil Strauss with The Game.
Right. Their goal is strictly utilitarian, actively decoding female psychology and body language to improve a man's chances of seduction, believing modern dating culture is overly hostile.
So taking a step back, does Riker endorse all these strategies?
Not necessarily endorsing them all as equal, but he validates their existence. He argues the manosphere is a direct, inevitable reaction to the systemic erosion of masculinity.
It's the antithesis fighting back.
Exactly. A decentralized space where men are desperately attempting to share strategies for survival in a world they feel has abandoned them.
So we've seen the trap, the history, the digital exile. What does this all mean? How does the book suggest men fight back in the real world?
That brings us to Section 6, The Road to Redemption.
The ultimate prescription.
And it isn't a new political party, it is a radical return to the past, reclaiming traditional unapologetic masculinity and fortifying it with the bedrock of religious faith.
The author argues men must aggressively embrace traditional masculine virtues: honor, courage, physical protectiveness, stoicism.
And he bases this on evolutionary biology. These traits are evolutionary adaptations hardwired into men to ensure the survival of the species. To suppress them is to invite chaos.
He also heavily praises the irreplaceable role of fatherhood, bringing back research from social scientist Charles Murray.
Undeniable data showing children raised in stable, two-parent homes with a biological father fare drastically better on almost every metric.
Academically, lower incarceration rates, more stable emotionally. Riker argues the data proves the patriarchy isn't oppressive, it is protective.
And knowing secular culture will attack this, the book points to organized religion as the ultimate bulwark. Religion provides the moral framework the state lacks.
He gives specific examples. The Mormon Church's unyielding focus on traditional gender roles.
Yes.
And the Catholic Church's Martha's Vineyard program. Not the island, but a spiritual retreat to help modern men rediscover their masculine identity and step up as loving fathers.
He also mentions the Conservative Mennonite Conference's True Masculinity program, countering the narrative of toxic masculinity by teaching that strength is a divine gift meant for service and protection.
Operating outside mainstream secular culture to save the nuclear family.
Right. And to intellectually ground this, Riker aligns himself with contemporary thinkers sounding the alarm.
Like Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Providing the psychological justification for order and hierarchy, Theodore Dalrymple on the consequences of liberal social policies, Christina Hoff Sommers exposing bias in education.
And Rollo Tomasi decoding intersexual dynamics. Riker presents these figures as guiding lights for modern men.
To reclaim their identity and reject cultural Marxism.
Wow. We have covered an absolute mountain of incredibly dense, sweeping material today.
A lot of ground covered.
Let's do a quick recap. We started with the critique of the choice myth and consent theory, showing how intimacy is weaponized.
We took a deep dive into the Marxist origins of no-fault divorce and family court traps.
We explored the Hegelian dialectic, pop culture media, and the education system waging war on young boys.
We waded into the explosive claims about Planned Parenthood and the abortion industrial complex.
Toured the manosphere MRMs, red pill, MGTOW, PUAs, and finally looked at the call to action, restoring traditional masculine virtues and religious values.
It is an incredibly dense, highly charged text. And before we close out, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to ponder.
Yes, please.
The book argues heavily that modern societal frameworks are artificial constructs dismantling our natural instincts. But if human societies are constantly evolving, what will the concept of partnership look like a century from now?
That's an interesting point.
We are on the precipice of artificial intelligence, artificial wombs, radical shifts in the global economy making traditional labor obsolete. Will the definitions of masculinity and femininity naturally adapt to those new alien environments?
Or are we inevitably bound to return to historical precedents because our fundamental biology absolutely demands it?
Exactly. Will biology always trump sociology? It is a profound question worth exploring on your own.
That is a fantastic, deeply philosophical question to leave off on. Listeners, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly intense journey today.
Thanks for listening.
Please do us a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the show right now so you never miss our future explorations. And I must remind you one more time, to truly understand the sheer depth of the arguments and data discussed today, you absolutely need to head over to Amazon, Kindle, and Google Playbooks to purchase the ultra-long ebook Marriage Deception for yourself.
Read the primary source, analyze his citations.
Exactly. See what you think of his conclusions. And finally, do not forget to follow the author at Conrad-Riker on Substack for more of his insights. Until next time, keep learning, keep analyzing, and keep questioning the narratives around you.